Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So this is super quick, really straightforward to make, really basically finished. So if you're interested in seeing how I sewed it up, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a mix of spandex and polyester. It has stretch in both directions and it's in this lovely navy polka dot. And on to the cutting out. This is my front piece. I have one layer of fabric underneath this pattern piece and I have a few notches here. So I've one at my armhole on each side and then three really important notches just around that little curve. So that's my front all cut out. So the first thing to do is to finish the edge of that little curve. So I'm just running that edge through the overlocker. So that's how that looks. So that's my front all prepped. So now to use those notches. So I have one on either side and one right at the center of this curve. So I'm just laying the bodice piece over the skirt, right sides together and lining up those notches. Making sure my edges are all lined up nicely and pinning. And once I get to that first little set of notches, I'm popping a pin vertically and a second pin about 1 centimeter away from the first. And then I'll continue to pin until I get about 1/2 centimeter away from that fold line. And this pinning is very specific, but you'll see how it all works in a second. So I'm going to stitch from the side seam to the first pin, leave a little gap, start again at the second pin, work my way across and finish at that third pin. So back stitching at the side seam, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, coming up to that first pin, back stitching, moving my fabric along until I get to the second pin, back stitching again, and working my way around to that third pin, back stitching. So that's that done. So I have my first little gap in the center and my second little gap just at that fold line. So now the next step is to press that seam open, which is what I'm doing here. There you can see my two little holes there. Again, you'll see how that works in a second. But first of all, I need to make my ties. So my fabric underneath this pattern piece is on the fold. I'm cutting two pieces. Got a nice little point at the end. So that's that done. I'm just folding them in half along their length, right sides together and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start, little pivot at the point, and up to the crease, back stitching. So that's that done. So now I just need to trim off those corners, which is what I'm doing here. So this will just help to get a nice, clean and crisp point at each of those corners. So off camera, I've turned my ties right side out and given them a nice press, and this is how they look. So happy with that. And now I need to join these two ties together at the short end. So just laying one over the other, pinning, and stitching here within my 1 centimeter seam allowance, just tacking these two pieces together. This will just make it a lot easier when I join this to the side seam, which is what I'm going to do next. So just laying those ties on top of my front, lining them up with the waist and the side seam. Pinning, and again I'm going to stitch here within my seam allowance, just tacking these onto this piece for now. So that's how that looks. So now to see what those little holes are for. So I'm just moving the top tie out of the way and placing the tie that's closest to the dress front through that first hole, pulling it through to the underside, and then feeding the point through that second hole, and pulling it out to the top side. Pop in a little knot there with the second tie, and you can see here this is what's creating that nice gathered effect around the front. So love how this looks. So now on to stabilising the neckline. So I'm using some stretch tape here, so I'm just lining it up with the neckline and pressing into place. Trimming off the excess tape, so that's that done. So that's my front all prepped and ready to be joined at the shoulder seams to the back. And for my back, my fabric underneath this pattern piece is on the fold. I have the normal little notches around the armhole and one at the top of the centre back at the neck. And off camera I've just ran that same stretch tape around the back neck, so you can see that here. And now just lining up my back with my front at the shoulders, right sides together and pinning. And ready to stitch. Back stitching at the start, at my 1 cm seam allowance, and back stitching at the end. That's my front and back joined at the shoulder seams. So off camera I've just ran that edge through the overlocker and given it a bit of a press, and of course I've done the same on the other side, and with that I'm ready to add my sleeves. So I have 2 layers of fabric underneath this pattern piece and the usual notches around the sleeve head, which I'll match up to the ones you've seen me snip on my front and back bodice. That's that done. And now just laying that sleeve right sides together with my bodice. First of all, lining up the shoulder, lining up the notches on the back, lining up the side seam, notch on the front, and other side seam. And off camera I'll just pop in a few more pins between those notches. And that's that done. And ready to stitch. Stitching here at my 1 cm seam allowance, back stitching at the start, taking it nice and easy around those curves, trying to stick to my 1 cm seam allowance the whole way around, and back stitching at the end. So I just need to tidy up that seam and give it a bit of a press, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. And now that my sleeves are in place, I'm ready to close up my side seams. So my fabric is right sides together. My raw edges are all lined up the whole way down and I've pinned. And stitching here at my 1 cm seam allowance, starting at the skirt hem and working my way the whole way down to the sleeve hem, back stitching at the start and the end, so that's that done. So I finished those edges on the overlocker and given them a nice press. And while I was at the overlocker, I just ran the edges of my hems through it, both the sleeve and the skirt hem, and pressed them both up by my allowance, so by about an inch, and ready to stitch. So starting with the hem of the skirt, back stitching at the start, I'm stitching directly through those overlock stitches and using the same stitch length I've used throughout, which will be listed in the description box, and back stitching at the end. So that's the hem of the dress complete. And now for the sleeve. So exactly the same thing here again, back stitching at the start, stitching directly through those overlock stitches the whole way around, and back stitching at the end. So that's that done. So off camera I've given my hems a good press, and this is how they look. Nice and neat and tidy. So the last thing I have to do to this dress is to close up the neck, and I've chosen to do that with a bias finish. So I've just cut myself a strip of the outer fabric, it's just over an inch or so wide, and I've pressed in one of the short edges by about 1 centimetre, and I'm lining up that pressed edge with the little notch you seen me snip earlier, and ready to stitch. Starting with a back stitch at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, taking it nice and easy here, trying to make sure that those raw edges are lined up the whole way around, and when I get back to my starting position, just trimming off any excess bias and stitching directly over the top. Back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks. So now I just need to trim down that seam allowance. So I'm taking off probably about 2/3 here. So that's that done. And now I need to press the bias away from the bodice, but make sure that that trimmed seam allowance in underneath is butted up against the bias. So you can see that here. So I'll finish that off camera, and now that that's done, I'm ready to understitch. So I'm stitching here through the bias tape and through that trim seam allowance in underneath, and I'm about 1 millimetre or so away from the seam that you just seen me sew. Back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. So to finish off the bias, I just need to fold that raw edge in underneath, give it a bit of a press, fold again so that that raw edge is completely encased, and give it a press. So I finished that off camera and pinned and ready to stitch. And I'm stitching here as close to that inner crease edge as I can get, using that same stitch length, back stitching at the start, taking it nice and easy here, and back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks, and I've given that a good press, and with that this little dress is complete. So I have that bias bound neckline, got my sleeves all in, all nicely hemmed, got that tie at the waist creating those lovely gathers, the hem of my skirt all nicely finished, and this is how it looks on. So I'm so happy with how this has turned out. I love the length of the skirt, the length of the sleeves, the shape of the neck. I absolutely love those gathers and ties. I love the shape that that creates. And you've just seen that this is a super straightforward little make. I think this is one that looks way more complicated than it is. And if you've been following over on my Insta stories, you will have seen the inspiration for this one. And I think I've got it just about right. I absolutely love how this has turned out.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!